Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Bienvenue à ces deux conférences qui sont présentées par le ministère des Relations internationales et de la francophonie, donc qui a invité nos deux conférenciers. Également impliqués dans l'organisation, j'aimerais souligner la participation du Centre d'études de la forêt, du groupe interdisciplinaire de recherche en agroforesterie et de la chaire en développement international. Donc, on a aujourd'hui la chance d'avoir deux conférenciers qui nous viennent de l'Université du Missouri aux États-Unis. Je vais vous présenter le premier conférencier qui me fait particulièrement plaisir de recevoir aujourd'hui, Shibu qui est un chercheur très connu dans le domaine de l'agroforesterie. Donc, j'ai eu l'occasion de rencontrer à plusieurs reprises dans des événements internationaux sur l'agroforesterie, dans des congrès, à partir même du congrès nord-américain d'agroforesterie qu'on avait organisé ici à Québec en 2007. J'ai eu la chance aussi de visiter des parcelles expérimentales à l'Université du Missouri, dont les siennes sur lesquelles il a fait des travaux qui ont donné lieu à des articles que je présente dans le cadre de mes cours depuis plusieurs années. Donc, ça me fait plaisir de le recevoir. Shibu a reçu son baccalauréat de l'Université agricole de Kerala, en Inde, et puis a réalisé une maîtrise et un doctorat en sciences forestières à l'Université Purdue. J'ai l'occasion de travailler avec lui beaucoup parce qu'il est rédacteur en chef de la revue scientifique la plus importante en agroforesterie, qui est Agroforestry Systems. Donc, c'est un rôle qui est particulièrement important. Il a été pendant 7 ou 8 ans, jusqu'à tout récemment, le directeur du Centre d'agroforesterie de l'Université du Missouri et il est maintenant directeur de l'École de ressources naturelles de la même université où il est également professeur. Donc, Shibu travaille beaucoup sur les relations, les interrelations écologiques dans les systèmes agroforestiers. Donc, il a beaucoup étudié les relations entre arbres et cultures pour tout ce qui a trait à l'approvisionnement en eau, à l'approvisionnement en lumière, à différentes variables du sol également, en particulier le carbone, mais aussi différents éléments nutritifs. Donc, c'est de ça qu'il va nous entretenir aujourd'hui et ça me fait donc plaisir de l'accueillir parmi nous, chez vous.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Well, thank you, Eileen. And I need to admit that I don't speak French. So whatever he said, I did not follow anything, but I'm assuming that he said something good. But even if it is something bad, don't worry. I didn't understand a thing. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here, and we've been here since yesterday, and at the invitation of the Quebec, the provincial government, to explore collaborations with Laval University. And so this is indeed our honor. So I have also my colleague, Dr. Rebecca North, with me, and so we both are going to be speaking to you this afternoon. I know we are scheduled for an hour each, and we will try to be short if we can, but keep in mind, I just became an administrator, but up until last year, I was also a professor, just teaching and doing research, and as teachers or instructors, we can talk for a long time. So, yeah, so I'll try to get out of that habit of, speaking for like an hour or two, no big deal, but today, for your sake, I'll try to keep it short. But I will start off with a brief overview of our School of Natural Resources. Since we are on a mission here, I thought it's important to set the stage. So we are both from the School of Natural Resources. It is, I often claim, as one of the most comprehensive schools of its kind in the country, and you will see why after going through this list of programs that eventually came into the school and became just one school. So, starting with soils, and then fisheries and wildlife, and then forestry, parks, recreation, and tourism, atmospheric sciences, and everybody moved into this beautiful building that we have back in 1988 under one umbrella as one School of Natural Resources. We had departments up until 2 years ago, but not anymore. We are just one school with 3 undergraduate degree programs, as you can see here: environmental science, natural resource science and management, parks, recreation, and sport. But within each degree, we can specialize, or students can specialize in any one of those areas. So you can see why we claim ourselves to be one of the most comprehensive universities in the US. If you look at our master's and PhD, you will see that we have a number of options there also, like agroforestry, forestry, and you can see pretty much all of the options, including 2 new programs, human dimensions and water resources. So those are areas that we are emphasizing now to really beef up our programs in research as well as in teaching. And we have about 60 faculty, including our co-op faculty, and about 70 full-time equivalent staff members running our show. Well, if you look at our research program, we are addressing pretty much everything that would be classified as a grand challenge for natural resources in the 21st century. We have somebody addressing all these topics. Well, if you look into that inside sphere, it's difficult to see. When we reorganized our school, we emphasized on terrestrial ecosystems, water resources, and human dimensions. And 2 of them I already mentioned, the water resources and human dimensions. Terrestrial ecosystems, everything that we do, but here it's another representation of what we do in the school. We represent, or we study, the geosphere, or the land, the atmosphere, the air, the hydrosphere, the water, and the biosphere, the humans, the animals, the fish, and of course, the sociology, or the human dimension surrounding everything related to the natural resources. So that's why we say we are one of the most comprehensive schools of its kind in the US. And of course, as a land-grant university in the US, we also have the Extension Engagement Mission, and these are some of our major extension programs represented here, including Dr. Rebecca North, who is with us here today. So if you look at our national ranking, we are highly ranked in almost everything that we offer in the US. A couple of our programs, for example, our PRT program, the Parks, Recreation, and Tourism, or Sport Management, we are number 1 according to College Factual. Our online master's program in environmental science category was ranked number 1 in the US just recently. And academic analytic ranking, we are pretty high in fisheries and wildlife, forestry, atmospheric sciences, and soil science. So just wanted to give this brief overview before I delved into my talk, which is focused on agroforestry. And then Dr. North will talk about, well, water resources and limnology, her core area of expertise. So, with that overview, I'm going to talk about what you came in for this afternoon. That is to hear this talk, Ecological Interactions in Perennial Polycultures. Polyculture, you know what it is. How many of you are ecologists in this group? Can I see a show of hands? All right. I know there are terrestrial, aquatic, all kinds of ecologists here in this group. How many of you would qualify as a forester? Okay, biologist? Agronomist, a molecular person, all right, soil scientist, any animal scientists in here? Okay, I know I missed some of your expertise, but any social scientists? Oh, there are a couple of people. Good. Well, I'm so sorry I don't have anything social science here because this talk is purely going into the ecology, but we understand the importance of our human dimensions, as I said. The agroforestry program, I headed that for about 7.5 years before I became the director of our School of Natural Resources. So the Center for Agroforestry is an interdisciplinary program with the biophysical dimensions as well as the socio-economic and policy dimensions covered by a number of faculty members from all over campus. So it is a campus-wide, representing almost 7 different colleges are represented in the Center for Agroforestry program. Although it is housed in the School of Natural Resources, it is truly an interdisciplinary program with all sorts of scientists working together to solve complex issues related to agroforestry as a land use practice. So today I'm going to focus on a small part of our research portfolio, the one that I've been focusing on as an ecologist, that is to looking at ecological interactions. And what does that mean, ecological interactions? Most of you know what does that mean when you try to put 2 different functional groups together. Most of our traditional agricultural landscape would involve just planting 1 crop on thousands of acres. For us in the Midwest of the United States, that means corn or soybean. The best that farmers do is rotating them, 1 year corn, the next year soybean, then corn again, then soybean. Some of them would just go with corn continuous or soybean continuous, but some of them at least rotate the crops. Well, on a landscape like this, we are talking about adding complexity by adding trees or shrubs onto that landscape. It could go the other way around also. A forest full of trees. We are thinning a few areas and putting some plants into the forest, like forest farming. That's also agroforestry. Well, so agroforestry, the definition of it is, the simplest definition the World Agroforestry Center came up with last year was trees on farms. But I would go a step further saying, well, it could be the farm in a forest also. It could go both ways. So anytime when you are introducing trees onto a farm, and in this example, on a pasture with cattle, you are putting some trees. There are multiple benefits of doing that. We have shown that the cattle gain more weight because of that stress reduction, either heat in the middle of the summer or cold stress in the middle of the winter. They gain more weight. More of that grass becomes beef or milk. So it is a proven benefit. But still, farmers don't want to do that. Why? Because they are fearful about the competition between the grass and the trees. Well, typical, all of us can see competition for light or shade, and they are afraid that when you put the trees, the shade is going to kill the grass. And we will come to that in a second, not in a second, maybe somewhere in the middle of my talk you will see that. That's not necessarily true. Well, that's only part of the story. Bulk of the story, when it comes to competition or ecological interactions, happens below ground. The hidden half, well, more than half. Competition for water, competition for all sorts of nutrients. And it could also be interference interactions with chemicals involved. So all sorts of interactions happening below ground. But most often people worry about, shading. If I put trees, that's shade. There's no way my grass will grow. I won't have a green pasture. I cannot do that. So my grad students and I have spent a lot of time investigating these interactions with the hope of making that system sustainable. There will be some level of competition, but reduce the competition, but increase the complementarity. And trying to balance the competition versus complementarity so that you can maintain sustainability in a system like this. That means you can make it biologically working for a long time so that it is going to be economically viable and farmers will adopt. How do you do that? So that's been part of my research portfolio for the last almost 25 years. But I've done all kinds of other things also as an ecologist, including, restoration ecology, invasive plant ecology and management, forest ecology, ecophysiology, well, you name it. But this has also been a good part of my research portfolio, not only in the US, but also in some tropical settings as well. And right now I have a student working in Panama looking at these interactions as part of his PhD work. So when you plant a tree on a farm like this is cotton, which is a common crop in the southern part of the United States. Well, you're not really worried about shading here because these trees are pecan trees, and they are not casting any shade or not much competition because you leave a little bit of space. But farmers are worried about losing that much space. And if you make a living out of these crops, losing this much space is a big deal. How many economists are here? Anyone as an economist? No? No. All right, but it's common sense. You can see that, wow, that's a lot of land lost in revenue. But if you can make up that with this crop, the tree crop, eventually it's good. So we did some economic analysis. Even if you do this and lose about 7 years of cropping here, but in 7 years the pecan will start yielding and you can make a decent living. And economically, over the long run, this is still better than just growing cotton alone or even pecan alone. Well, when the pecan trees become this large, can you still grow cotton? Well, a picture is worth 1,000 words. You are looking at it. Most people would say, forget about it. No way, these trees are 47-year-old. You cannot get a crop of cotton under these pecans. That's what everybody told me. Well, we tried it, and look at that. That's beautiful. That's almost like a monoculture. But there is a trick behind it, which I will reveal in a few minutes. But you can grow cotton. You don't need to abandon your cornfield or cotton field just because you have some trees. You can put them together and make it sustainable. In this case, for 47 years. You can still continue to grow them together. It's possible. Well, here's another example. That is corn. It was in Indiana, in the middle of the what we call the corn belt in the US, trying to grow some black walnut. A single black walnut tree can fetch thousands of dollars, 5, 6, 10,000. If it is a really big tree, 80, 90 years old, maybe $20,000 if it is good quality. So why wouldn't you grow a few black walnut trees? Well, your corn crops will suffer, as you can see here. So this is where I started doing some experiments when I was a PhD student, because I had access to some long-term data. Well, when I say long-term, it's all relative. I had data from 86 through 93 at that point, and that's when I started exploring in 93. What's going on here? The yield is going down, as you can see. And if you look at early on, these were the tree seedlings, and we had 6 rows of corn. The outer rows were yielding more. You can see productivity was higher. Well, by 93, you can see those outer rows, because the trees are big now, were smaller, and the yield became very low. Makes sense, competition. But competition for what? Well, immediately, we would hypothesize that, yeah, light is the reason. If you look at light levels, light is the reason. You can see shading, a lot of shading. And you look at the corn yield and the light transmittance, a 12% reduction, 39% reduction in yield. You have a nice correlation. It's all about light. And here is more physiological evidence. If you look at the PAR, the photosynthetically active radiation, versus the net photosynthetic rate, you will see that corn, being a C4, the more the light, the greater the yield. Makes sense. Well, so my project could have pretty much ended right there. I proved it. It's all about light. Luckily, we did something else, which I will explain in a second. Let me introduce that other system that I talked about, 47-year-old trees. The trees in the corn, they were only 12 years. We had a lot more shade, up to 60% reduction in PAR, as you can see. Remember this, a 12% reduction, a 39% reduction in yield. Let's see what happened with the 50% reduction in cotton, that's the graph here, 58% reduction, only a 4% reduction in yield. So what's going on? Well, here is the physiological explanation. This is the photosynthetic light response curve for a C3 plant, actually original data from these cotton plants. You can see they get light saturated right about 500 micromoles, well, fourth of the full sun. That means they can grow under shade, just like a maple, shade tolerant. They are shade tolerant. They can grow just fine. They don't need the full sun like corn. Even at a fourth of the full sun, they are reaching their maximum photosynthetic rate. What does that mean? Yield is not even affected. One of the reasons. So, again, this could be, if you just see this graph without knowing the whole story, you would say that, wow, so light is everything for a C4, but if there is no light competition, a C3 plant would do just fine. Ecological sustainability, no problem. Why are you wasting your dollars experimenting and analyzing all of this? Well, I will get to that in a second. Here is another system where we try to grow shade-tolerant shrubs that can be used in ornamental industry under pine plantations as an alley cropping system, and we failed. I don't want to take you through all the data and make it boring, but the story was that, yeah, there was shading, and these are adapted to shade, but when we tried to grow them together, they were not really growing that well compared to the monoculture outside in the open sun. So you can hypothesize that under light-limited conditions, the growth of roots is reduced more than the growth of the aerial parts. Plants grow taller, leaner, they try to reach the sunlight at the expense of the root system. So the root system will be smaller, so you will get a decrease in the root-shoot ratio. That's all true. There's nothing wrong with the hypothesis. We saw that, but here was the trick. What we did was we actually trenched, separating the root systems of the trees from the root systems of the crop. So they were not really competing each other. So what happened when we did that? Look at this animation first. So we had this shape in the beginning, the convex. Well, when we actually trenched, the corn plants were growing like just fine. With light was not the factor. It was all about competition below ground. So when we trenched the root systems and separated them with a plastic barrier, these plants were producing pretty much like normal monoculture plants. So we had a 37% increase in yield just by doing that. And we saw the same thing when we did that for the cotton. That was almost 12 years later, I believe, or maybe 10 years later, and we saw the same result. This was in Indiana, this was in Florida. And we saw the same, well, again, happened to be 37% increase, but you can see the yield became almost identical to the monoculture that is shown here. So you can see that it was not necessarily the competition for light, it was actually competition for water or nutrients. We don't know what it was, but below ground. And now I would like to pose this question, is shade necessarily a bad thing? It depends. It can be a good thing. So here, we summarized data from multiple studies over a number of years and looked at cool season grasses, warm season grasses, warm season legumes, cool season legumes, all these plants used as forage or grasses and legumes for cattle on a pasture. What are we looking at? I would like to draw your attention to a couple of graphs. If you look at the biomass, you can see that these plants, irrespective of C4 grasses or C3 legumes, they didn't need 100% sunlight. They would gain or reach their maximum biomass when the light was only about 45%. You look at the crude protein here. The greater the shade, the better. So they didn't need the highest sunlight. The crude protein, which that's what you're looking for in a forage crop, was actually higher when the the light level was lower. But if you wanted the best forage in terms of the quality and the quantity, then you would pick the 45%. Well, that's about what you get when you plant trees on a pasture. So contrary to the traditional belief that if I put trees on my pasture, oh, my grass is going to die, it's not going to grow, that's not necessarily true. You can get good growth and good quality forage even under shade, provided that there is enough moisture and nutrients in the soil. So light doesn't have to be the deal breaker in terms of planting a silvopasture system. So it's all about rooting density, which I mentioned earlier. But what happens to the roots? That is an interesting, I know there are a lot of ecologists studying the below-ground interactions. So it's fascinating to see, and I would like to draw your attention to a couple of graphs here. The first one here. For the unit amount of carbon, you can see with competition, they were not producing a lot of roots, but without the competition, they were producing a lot more roots for the same amount of carbon. So the specific root length varied as a result of that intense competition. Look at here. This is also interesting. Without the competition, that is the barrier, you can see 33% of the fine roots were in the upper 30 centimeter of the soil. See how that changed with competition. Another crop, a major tree, competing. A powerful competitor, and the little cotton plant is yielding to that competition, sending its roots deeper and deeper. But you know that it's important to have roots in that upper 30 centimeter of the soil, especially for nutrient uptake. So it went from 33% to 14% at that point. But the roots were kind of going deeper. In agroforestry, if we can design a plant tree system with tree crops going deeper and the crops in the upper layer, there is niche separation, oh, that would be ideal. But that doesn't often happen. You are somewhere in that, this being ideal to maybe the worst case scenario, they are both competing, that would be the worst case. Some level of complementarity like this in terms of the niche sharing would make the system sustain in the long run. Anyway, we published all of that in a recent paper in Agroforestry Systems. It's again a summary of all the findings, and this was a study done in the tropics with P32 looking at root activity, and done by Dr. Kumar, my co-author here, with coconut and cacao planted together. What you see is what I just explained in terms of the root activity. Here is root activity within the 25 centimeter, the top soil depth, and here is in the deeper. So as you move, well, when the cacao plant is closer to the bamboo, or in this case this was bamboo, but similar, bamboo also has got a fibrous root system, pretty extensive, just like the coconut. You will see the root activity is much reduced in the cacao. And that's the message here, but in the deeper, then it is much more active. But this was done using P32. Well, I wanted to do a similar field study in the US, but forget about getting permission to do P32 in the field. So we couldn't do that. Anyway, so if there is competition below ground between the root systems, well, it's common sense. It's either for water or for nutrients or for both. So we found competition for water. So without the competition, you can see soil water level much higher, and the red line shows when two species are put together, they are competing for the same amount of water. These are rain-fed systems. You are not adding any extra water. Then they are competing. As a result, a lot more uptake together, and the soil gets drier faster. That's the message here. What happens when the soil gets drier? Well, it shows up. If you look at the corn plant water uptake, we monitored that weekly, well, daily, and you can see over the season there was a 26% reduction as a result of the trees competing, those black walnut trees competing. Well, when there is competition for water, what happens for nutrient uptake? First of all, nutrient turnover or mineralization in the soil is reduced, as you can see here, but nutrient uptake is also affected, because at least two of the major processes helping nutrients to get into the plants, they are water mediated. Well, less water means less uptake. So we had, with competition or without competition here, we had 40% higher, 41% higher nitrogen, either in the grain or stover, which shows that, yeah, there is competition for water, and also there is competition for nitrogen at least, when you put these two species together. But is it always competition for water when you put tree and a crop together? Not necessarily. How many of you have heard of this hydraulic lift? Some of you, yeah, many of you. So that can kick in. I don't have the time to go into the details, but it's essentially making the water available for other plants on the surface layer here. So this is kind of a modeling exercise, but you can see sugar maple with hydraulic lift happening in sugar maple, overall estimated water use by a forest stand in New England was much higher. But if it didn't happen, it will be much lower. That's what it shows essentially. So here is an agroforestry example from Argentina. And I will, without going through the figures, I will make it simpler just by showing the picture here. Again, a picture is worth 1,000 words. You can see this is during the dry season. What do you see here? Green grass under the tree, under this prosopis tree. And that is the result of hydraulic lift. There is water right around the tree making that grass grow better. And that's what the data show here too. It only works during the dry season, it's beneficial. So it's not always competition. There can be complementarity when you put them together sometimes. Well, I showed the data where the corn nitrogen uptake was low. Does it really prove there was competition for nitrogen? We actually followed that using N15 as a tracer. And look at that. We saw N15 taken up by the walnut trees when we didn't have the barrier. That means when there was competition. That's all I want to say about this, but also want to talk about the safety net hypothesis in agroforestry. How many of you know what is the safety net hypothesis? One, all right. Well, I know others also know about it, probably you don't remember. Essentially, look at this. When you have corn planted or grown alone, there are agronomists here, so let me ask you this question. How much of the applied nitrogen fertilizer is actually taken by a corn plant or a cotton plant? Ballpark. 60%? It's anywhere from 30 to 60%, and usually it's below 50. In most cases, only 30. So when you put 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre, sorry, as you know, I'm from the US now. I used to do everything, the SI units, but now I've forgotten everything. So 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And only 30% is going into the plant. What happens to the rest? Yeah, it goes down and goes into your drinking water or your stream or your creek or your lake. And you'll hear that from Rebecca later. Well, having a tree here, what does it do? Trees have, relatively speaking, deeper roots. They can act as a safety net, like picking up that extra nitrogen, bringing it back to the leaves, and then dropping it later into the surface and better, tighter nutrient cycling. So, chances are that nitrogen is not going into the groundwater or into your stream or lake. You get cleaner water, the soil have more richer, fertile soil in the top layer because of all that extra nitrogen brought back to the surface. Well, is that really happening? Yes, it is. You can see no barrier, that means competition. Trees were taking up a lot more nitrogen, so you can see that single line here almost. Whereas look at here, you can see this peak in the 60 and 90 centimeter depth. A lot of nitrogen going down into the deeper layers, eventually into the groundwater. So the N15 results clearly showed that the safety net role of tree roots is happening here, which is a good thing. And that is the principle that we make use when we plant the riparian zones. And we have plenty of data from our own studies and the studies done at Iowa State University showing that you can reduce total nitrogen up to 80%, total phosphorus up to 93% if you plant those trees and shrubs and grasses as a filter. But most farmers plant up to the edge of the creek, and if they can plant, they would even plant inside the creek. Because every inch is valuable in their mind, but they are not thinking about all the nutrients, all the soil they are losing. And you know how much soil is lost in the Midwest every year, annually, from an average farm? More than 12 tons. And if you, 4? Okay. Which is roughly about an inch, I guess. That's the data that I remember, about an inch of soil. Do you know how long does it take to produce an inch of soil? Yeah, I'm not asking to be exact, but it could be anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years to produce an inch of soil, and you are losing that in 1 year. And what is your most valuable resource as a farmer? Well, come on, it is your soil. And that's what you are just losing every year to the creek. But still they want to plant towards the very edge of the creek. But if you lose a little bit of land here, that's saving. That is insurance against soil loss for thousands of years. Well, that's not the way most farmers think, unfortunately, even with solid evidence and data like this. Well, we have a lot more outreach and extension engagement to do. Anyway, my story continues. So, is there really competition for nitrogen? I saw a lot less nitrogen in the foliage with competition. That means the photosynthetic rate was low. If you have low photosynthesis, that means low growth rate. These are all the ecophysiology that you clearly have seen in other studies, and we saw the same things. But I want to focus on one thing here. It's not all about just the net photosynthetic rate on an area basis. It's also the whole canopy photosynthesis. So what is that missing variable here? How big the leaves are, or how big the canopy is. So we looked at how big the canopy was. Oh, there it is. So we measure it. This is why we have graduate students. How many of you are graduate students? I apologize to all of you, because this is what we do to you. Send you to collect the difficult data, be there in the sun, just measure every leaf on every plant. Well, my poor grad students back then did. Well, I did too as a grad student, so don't feel bad. And look at that. You have bigger leaves when you don't have competition, and with competition, smaller leaves. So the size of the plant matters, along with the net photosynthetic rate per unit area. When you put them together, you get the canopy photosynthesis. That drives productivity. And what is the first thing that is affected in a plant or its growth phase when there is water stress? There are molecular folks here and physiologists here. What is the first process that is affected when there is water stress? Well, even before that something happens, the cell elongation just stops. It's instantaneous. So what does that mean? Leaf growth can be affected. The size of the leaf, you will clearly see if there is a plant that is water stressed, it will have smaller leaves, smaller canopy. The size, overall, the canopy size will be much smaller. Because you need turgidity in the cells, right? So they will feel the very first when there is water stress. So, leaf size is important. When you deal with species like black walnut, there is one more thing. Black walnut produces a chemical that is known for at least 2 millennia. In the first century, there were records of black walnut, not black walnut, the English walnut producing that compound. Does anyone know what it is? Juglone, that's right. Well, Demas, I expect you to know that, but anyway, so juglone, it's a chemical. It's one of the first known examples of allelopathic interactions or chemical interference. Well, is that going on in a system like this when you have black walnut or pecan even? Even pecan produces juglone. And these were the two crop or tree crops that we used in most of our alley cropping systems because they produce either wood or nuts. You can use both. They give really good income. From pecan, you can produce maybe $1,500 extra per year per acre. So why wouldn't you plant that? Well, then how about this juglone? Is that going to have an effect on your crop? Here it is. Again, I don't want to show you all the data, but you can look at the picture. Here is the control with no juglone. Here is what you would see normally in the soil. You can see, yeah, if there is juglone, it can affect the crop growth. We did that for soybean and corn and then cotton, but this is in a hydroponic system, as you can see, grown in liquid, right? What happens in actual soil? Well, we didn't know, but we wanted to test how much juglone is in the soil. Well, it affects not only the growth, but the physiology, as you can see, in corn, soybean, and we have similar data for cotton. But look here, this is, again, fascinating, because up until we did this, everybody, including us, thought that the leaves contributed to most of the juglone on the surface and in the soil. Because in the fall, all the leaves fall, and you have fruits on the floor, and we suspected that, all the juglone is coming from the foliage. But guess what? When we had that trench, beyond the trench, there was nothing. No detectable levels of juglone in the soil. Even with all the foliage still on the surface, there was nothing. What does that tell you? You have to have an active source, keep on producing juglone for the juglone to be present in the soil. So that was coming from the roots. The juglone released from the foliage got changed into non-toxic forms. They got oxidized in a hurry because they were in the soil surface or on the soil surface. So, active management. So, this is again, the red line is the fine root biomass. So when we put the barrier, there was no active live roots beyond that, and there was no active amount of juglone in the soil either. So if you can do some management interventions, one would be like training the roots to go deeper, because cutting the roots and putting the barrier may not be practical in an agricultural setting. Well, you don't need to do that. All you need to do is when you plant the trees, train them by deep disking. So the roots will keep going deeper and deeper. They will avoid that plow layer because every year you are plowing the ground. So if you plow layers like that, that would take care of that problem. Most likely you won't have to face juglone or competition for water or nutrients at that point. Well, I'd also like to talk about tritrophic interactions just briefly. That involves the herbivores, the predators, the primary producers, the consumers. So how do we make use in agroforestry these tritrophic interactions? I'll just show you an example. I don't want to get into the theoretical basis there. Most of you may have heard about those two. I'm sorry, my circle is actually moved. But let me take you through this seemingly complex table, but it is very simple. You are looking at the herbivores that are harmful to a crop. Okay, they eat the leaves, foliage, they are harmful. Predators, they eat the herbivores. Okay, and then parasitic hymenoptera, like the spiders, and they also eat most of your herbivores. And that's the principle that you make use in biological control, right? So what's happening here? Alley cropping or monocropping here, those are the two scenarios. Let me draw your attention to this first line here. You can see alley cropped. You can see the Shannon index of the herbivores is lower here than the monocropped. So let's look at here the evenness, or let's forget about that, the predator. It's low here, but this is the predator. Insects were high, as you can see here. And also, if you look at the parasitic hymenoptera, they were also much higher in terms of the diversity here in the alley cropped setting compared to the monocropping. And why? Because they feed the host insects or the herbivores, and of course their mortality will go up. They will go down in numbers and in diversity. It's that simple. Why are we seeing more of the parasitic hymenoptera and predators? Because of that increased plant diversity in the system, because of the trees present in the system. And if it is just a monocrop, chances are you are going to have what you see here, higher incidence of herbivores, then you will have to spray and control the damage. And then, of course, this can also lead to an organic system if you make it right with the right mix of species. So you can actually make it complementary by putting the species together the right way. So with all of that, this is my last slide. So in conclusion, well, I try to leave you with a simple message. Well, when I say simple, you can see S-I-M-P-L-E. That is the simple message, which stands for species. Choose species wisely when you design an agroforestry system so you can make it sustainable. The wrong species mix, you are starting from, like ground zero, you are setting it up for failure. You don't want to do that. So, start with the right species. Interactions, you cannot avoid them when you are putting species together in a polyculture, including agroforestry. You cannot avoid interactions. Well, then what do? You maximize complementarity and minimize competition. We saw multiple examples of what happens, how can we avoid, reduce. You cannot always eliminate these interactions, but you can try to minimize the competition and maximize the complementarity. Manage intensively. Nobody said agroforestry was not intensive. There is unfortunately, perception that agroforestry must be simple, easy. Well, it's not. When you have 2 or 3 species mixed together, well, you're adding complexity to the system. Now you have to manage 3 different species and their interactions, not just one species like in a monoculture. Well, you have to manage that intensively. Plan for the long term. Don't think that it is like an annual cycle. It's unfortunately not. Because in an agroforestry, you always have a woody perennial, a shrub or a tree. You are in it for the long run. That is something that landowners must understand and take into consideration. Once you set up these trees, you may want to wait for 7 years, 10 years, 12 years, or maybe 80 years if it is like a timber species. Learn from experience. We are all learning by doing it. Unfortunately, it's not we say it has grown considerably, and the journal that I think Alan mentioned that I heard agroforestry systems. That's the only thing I understood when he was introducing me. I act as the editor-in-chief for that journal. When I started almost 10 years ago, we had 150 submissions a year. Now we are over 400. So you can see that the science is growing, the science behind agroforestry. But still, I wouldn't claim that we know everything. We are still learning every day, learning by doing. So there are no simple answers for most of the challenges that we face in agroforestry. Evaluate and monitor and share your findings with others. And this is where outreach becomes critical. We try to do it, we get some early adopters to do it, and then we share their experience with other farmers from peer to peer. That's the only way for agroforestry to gain some notoriety among landowners and make it like widespread among the agricultural communities. So with that, thank you for your time. And I don't know if I have time for questions. I'll be glad to take some questions if I have the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Merci. We have time for a few questions. On a le temps pour quelques questions.
Yeah, thank you, Jose, for your nice talk. You talk about training the roots by disking or things like that, but I think your take-home message about choosing wisely the plants is certainly the most appropriate. And I think there have been less research about the genetics of the root architectures. And I think agroforesters have to do this kind of work.
Well, very appropriate. You know this very well, that when it comes to crop breeding for agroforestry in particular, we haven't done a thing. We still have a long way to go, as you know, because most of our efforts are focused on monocultural systems and maximizing productivity that way. We are not really thinking of, how do you manage the plant architecture for, let's say, a polyculture scenario. One day, hopefully, we will get there. Some of the work that you are doing will be helpful, and we are also trying to do that, but it's just getting started as we speak. We just concluded a trial where we were trying to, again, this was just a selection process. We evaluated about 90+ accessions of a C4 grass. And we often think that a C4 grass is shade intolerant. Guess what? When we looked at these 90+ accessions with different levels of shade, what we found was there was a 7-fold difference in terms of its least shade tolerant versus most shade adapted. The most shade adapted switchgrass had almost 7 times more biomass. So imagine we can exploit such variation and breed further to produce a switchgrass that can grow under maybe 30% shade with no big deal. Well, we haven't unfortunately done anything like that. It's just beginning to happen now. But good comment.
I was wondering what are the water quality outside of the growing field. So when the safety net is in place, what is the percentage of nitrogen passing through that net and going in the water? So.
Yeah, I had a graph there showing some of the data. Maybe you missed it, but I don't want to go back to the slide, but let me tell you based on from what I remember, we've seen anywhere from 60 to probably 90% reduction in phosphorus and nitrogen as a result of, but it depends on how do you really set that up. And that came primarily from the riparian zone research, when you have riparian buffers. But even alley cropping, you can imagine a similar level of reduction in the nitrate and phosphate going into the groundwater. But it depends on, keep in mind, how big the trees are, and when do you apply the fertilizer? Let's say you apply the fertilizer in April, and the trees, let's say they break buds in May. Then you may miss that window of opportunity for them to be taking up that nutrient. Because active nutrient uptake takes place perhaps early on when the trees are really breaking bud and expanding their leaves, right? And if you put the nitrogen well before or plant your crop before, and if they are not aligned properly in terms of the timing, the phenology, you may not get all the benefits. So you need to, again, choose the species wisely so that either riparian zone or alley cropping, you are deriving that benefit. So the absolute amount of filtration will depend on the species and your configuration.
Thanks for your talk. I was wondering if there are any federal or state policies that would have to promote temperate agroforestry, because we have that same kind of the challenge here of getting farmers to change the way that things are done. So do you have any kind of particular things that are working?
We do. And we do have incentive programs like Environmental Quality Incentive Program, or EQIP. That's one federal program, and there is Wildlife Habitat Enhancement Program and WEP. So there are programs where you will get funding from federal government where you can actually use that to put in more trees on your farmscape so that you are either cleaning up your water or providing habitat for wildlife or pollinators or deriving some sort of an ecosystem service as a result, protecting the soil. So there are programs available. But how many of the farmers are making use of them? Well, not very many. But even if they are making use, sometimes they have loopholes. Like, let's say somebody is getting EQIP. They can put in a riparian zone, but many of them would prefer the easy route, that is terracing. So an engineering solution rather than a biological solution. And, well, is terracing that effective as a riparian buffer? not really, but, well, unfortunately, that also qualifies for that program. So we had a major program, and Rebecca may talk about it, the Mississippi River Basin Initiative, where we were supposed to get a ton of acres under that program for riparian zones. But over 99% of the farmers who made use of that program chose terracing rather than planting the riparian zone. So we missed a big opportunity. I was hopeful that they would make it mandatory to use a biological solution rather than an engineering solution, but that didn't happen. But we also found having some specific trees and their microbial communities will be helpful in taking care of antibiotics. Like in a silvopasture system, you probably know 80% of the antibiotics administered in a cow or any of the livestock will come through the other end. And then it is deposited on the soil surface. Where does it go from there? Into the water. What we found was if you had poplar, which is a common species used even in Quebec, the microbial communities of poplar roots would we used a couple of antibiotics, one is sulfamethazine, would disintegrate that in a hurry. In 3 days, it's gone from the soil. If we have poplar planted in a silvopasture configuration or in a riparian buffer, if we didn't have poplar, they will stay there for 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. It makes sense. The chief of the Natural Resource Conservation Service heard that when he visited us once, and he was so fascinated by that, he went back and made that a priority for their ACRue program. So that is one success story where our research actually translated to something policy like in a hurry. Usually that would take, decades. In this case, it took only like a couple of months. He was so excited about it. Anyway, so there are programs, but still the net result is not so encouraging, even with money available. Yes.
Hello. In agroforestry, we talk a lot about polyculture. But beside forest garden, a lot of agroforestry system is just 2 species, normally a tree and a crop in most of the system studied. Do you think that adding more complexity when adding more species in this system can open a Pandora box on management of this system for farmers? Do you think that adding complexity will remove some benefits because of management?
Adding complexity, let me give you, again, I don't know how much time I have, but if I have a minute, I would like to take, I should be stopping now. Well, my grandma, I would always claim, was the best agroforester that I ever knew because she had 58 species. That was when I was back there about 7 years ago with a colleague of mine visiting my parents' home. It's only 1/3 of an acre. Keep in mind, only 1/3 of an acre with a house in the middle, and it's a beautiful example of a tropical home garden. Well, my grandma died almost 30 years ago, but the trees and the crops, and not crops, but the shrubs that she planted, most of them are still there. So when she was alive, actively managing, I'm sure that it was a complex system like a tropical rainforest with maybe hundreds of species. My colleague Darlene Nichols and I counted about 58 different species in 1/3 of an acre still existing without any actual management at this point. So species are disappearing, obviously, but still 58 species. Well, we can make it work, even a complex polyculture like that. But a lot of that was my grandma only had a 4th grade schooling. How did she learn all of that? Traditional knowledge. I took a sandalwood tree once that I got from school and planted in the middle of our front yard. And Grandma said, no, you cannot plant it there. And I said, no, I should plant it here. In the end, Grandma won, but the reason she gave me was, it needs a mom. And I said, oh, come on, Grandma. I was in 5th grade. At least I'm in 5th grade. You only went to 4th grade. I know a little bit more. I will plant it here. And she said, no, it needs a mom. And I said, you are foolish. It's not a human baby. It's a plant. It doesn't need a mom. And she insisted it needs a mom. And I planted in the end, near another tree. She only knew that. It took me another, how many years? Well, anyway, when I was in my junior year in college in learning forestry, that's when I learned that, wow, sandalwood is a semi-root parasite or hemi-root parasite. What does that mean? Do you know? It puts its roots through the other plants to absorb the nutrients and water. If you just plant it alone, it wouldn't be very effective in taking up nutrients and water. So it needed a nourishing, bigger tree next to it. Oh, Grandma didn't know there was that root association happening below ground. No, she only needed a mom. So most of their traditional knowledge came that way. Maybe something else needed a dad, something needed an uncle, so they knew that and set up this beautiful home garden. So when complexity goes up, there are multiple benefits. You can probably, I never remember us adding anything chemical into the, third of an acre. There was a balance in everything. We've missed all of that. I struggled to put two species together in the US context. So who is a better agroforester, me or my grandma? You answer that. With all the scientific data, we still struggle to put two species together and fail sometimes. And I have a PhD. Well, that's where I will stop with that answer, but we can talk more. I think you got my message. There's a way to do it, but you need to learn how to do it.
Thank you very much on these words on traditional knowledge and the way to manage complexity. While in the last decades we tried to do very simple and artificial things with our agricultural systems. So I think it's a nice way of finishing talking about agroforestry. And if you're interested in agroforestry, si vous intéressez à l'agroforesterie, si vous avez le goût de vous amuser avec ces questions de concurrence pour la lumière, de concurrence pour l'eau, de facilitation, de relations de facilitation dans les sols, il y a un cours d'agroforesterie qui se donne cet automne qui commence lundi. Donc, vous pouvez toujours vous inscrire. Ça nous fera plaisir de vous accueillir. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you all very much.